I am the famous American. Let's explore the concept of eating like our ancestors. Now, specifically here in the United States, something I mentioned culturally as Americans, that we don't really have our own culture that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Our culture here in the United States is more of a recent one. It's more eclectic. We have adopted from many other things. When you think of, well, what is American food? I think most people, especially in Europe, would say, oh, American food, that'd be burgers and fries and fried chicken and pizza. Well, we've collectively borrowed those ideas from other places, which I get it. Pizza here in the United States is not the same version of pizza as when it came from Italy. And a hamburger here in the United States is not necessarily rooting all the way back to Germany in the way that we might give it credit. But as Americans, when it comes to our own food choices and what we would eat, it's interesting that for the most part we have adopted this model of what the American diet is, which is largely a lot of processed carbohydrates and processed meats. That's a large what it is, processed food, I think a lot of people think. Then there's people like me who don't eat that way, but we're often known as the exception to the rule, which we are adopting. For me personally, I'm adopting a diet probably that roots closer to German or Spanish, which happens to equal about 2/3 of my DNA according to my DNA test. I am about a third German and about a third Spanish. But it's interesting because if here in the United States, if we see someone who we can look at them and pretty much predict what kind of food they're going to eat, if we see someone who has typical features of someone from the country of India, we would assume, okay, well, yeah, they like curry, they like rice, that if they eat meat, they eat chicken. We could make certain concepts about them, but especially if they're not a first generation American, maybe they're a second generation Indian American, they may not even like Indian food. They may distance themselves from that and adopt more of the modern American diet as far as burgers, fries, pizza, etc. So it's interesting though, because sometimes all we really have is a last name as far as to tie us to our ethnic background, right? So if someone has a Polish last name like Grabinski, just for example, just off the top of my head, someone, oh, you're Polish, I bet you like eating sausage, I bet you like sauerkraut, and we make up these ideas, maybe or maybe not. I think that's something to consider, is how many chains of separation, like links in the chain of separation, are there between someone being a first generation American or not? Chances are, if you're a first generation American, you're going to eat food that has been passed down from the country that your ancestors came from. But if you're like me, granted, about 100 years ago or so, that's when half of my ancestors arrived here in the United States. Half of them from Italy and half of them from Mexico. But at this point, technically, I'm a third generation American on those sides. So am I a big fan of Mexican food or Italian food? Honestly, I'm not. I mean, largely because I subscribe to the keto diet. So those Mexican food and Italian food don't quite go so well. Like I said, German food and Spanish food really lines up a little bit better for me, where bread and carbohydrates are not such a big part of that. But I do think that that's interesting. I think, and that's the theory I want to share with you. Depending on what generation American you are is largely going to depend on how far you are removed from eating like your ancestors did. What are your thoughts? What are your opinions? Because they matter.